It started innocently enough. Small things going missing around the house. A spoon here, a pair of socks there. At first, I chalked it up to my own forgetfulness. I'd just moved into the house a few months earlier, and with the chaos of unpacking, it seemed reasonable to misplace a few things. But then, it got stranger. The missing items weren't just disappearing. They were reappearing in odd places. A mug I distinctly remembered leaving in the sink would show up on the coffee table. My phone charger turned up on top of the fridge, a place I'd never even thought to put it. At the same time, my cat, Willow, started acting off. She'd always been a laid-back, affectionate cat, but now she spent hours staring at the basement door, her tail flicking nervously. At night, she'd hiss at nothing or bolt down the hallway as if something unseen had startled her. The noises began soon after. At first, I thought it was just the old house settling. Creaks, groans, the occasional thump. But they were too deliberate, too rhythmic. Footsteps. Light, careful footsteps. Always at night, and always coming from the basement. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was pipes or the wind, I told myself, even though deep down, I didn't believe it. My unease grew when I noticed the basement door was slightly ajar one morning. I was certain I had closed it the night before. Still, I avoided going down there. The basement had always made me uncomfortable. It was cold, dimly lit, and full of the previous owner's forgotten junk. But the noises and Willow's behavior finally pushed me to investigate. I chose a Saturday afternoon when the sunlight streaming through the windows made me feel braver. Armed with a flashlight and a broom, I wasn't sure what I was expecting to find. I made my way down the narrow, creaky stairs. At first glance, nothing seemed out of place. The basement was cluttered, but undisturbed. Boxes stacked against the walls, old furniture covered in dust. But then, I noticed something odd. A faint trail of footprints in the layer of dust on the floor. The prints weren't mine. They led to the far corner of the basement, where an old, heavy wardrobe stood. My heart raced as I approached it, the air feeling heavier with each step. When I opened the wardrobe, I didn't find clothes or junk. Instead, I found a small, makeshift living space. Inside were a thin sleeping bag, a few rumpled blankets, and a plastic crate filled with random items. Canned food, a water bottle, and several of the things I'd been missing. A spoon, a pair of socks, my old phone charger. There was even a half-eaten granola bar sitting on a shelf inside. My stomach turned as I realized what this meant. Someone had been living down here. I stepped back, flashlight trembling in my hand, and that's when I noticed it. The faint smell of sweat, stale and unmistakable. It was fresh. Whoever had been here was still close. I spun around, shining my flashlight across the basement. The beam caught a glimpse of something, a shadow moving at the far edge of the room, behind a stack of boxes. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. No answer. I moved closer, heart pounding. As I reached the stack of boxes, I heard a sharp intake of breath, followed by frantic rustling. "Stop! I'm not going to hurt you," I said, unsure if I was trying to reassure them or myself. A figure bolted from behind the boxes, dashing toward the stairs. It was a man, thin and disheveled, his face pale and gaunt. He didn't look back as he scrambled up the steps and out of the basement, slamming the door behind him. I followed, but by the time I reached the top of the stairs, he was gone. The front door was wide open, swinging in the wind. I called the police, who searched the property and the surrounding area, but found no trace of him. They said it wasn't uncommon for squatters to take up residence in empty or neglected spaces, especially in older homes like mine. For weeks after, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow flickering in the corner of my vision made my skin crawl. Even Willow remained skittish, avoiding the basement entirely. Eventually, I installed new locks on all the doors and windows and set up security cameras. The basement remains empty now, but sometimes, late at night, I still think I hear footsteps. And once, when reviewing footage from the camera pointed at the back door, I saw a faint movement at the edge of the yard, a figure disappearing into the trees. I haven't seen him since, but I can't help wondering if he's still out there, watching, waiting for his chance to come back. It started as a minor home improvement project, one of those things I'd been putting off since I moved in. My house, a modest Cape Cod-style home built in the 1940s, had a damp and slightly creepy basement that I avoided whenever possible. But when a slow leak from an ancient pipe forced me to venture down there, I decided I might as well make the most of it and start tidying up. The basement wasn't large, just a single room with a low ceiling and walls made of crumbling cinder blocks. I started by clearing out the clutter left behind by the previous owners. Old tools, broken furniture, and cardboard boxes filled with yellowed papers and water-damaged books. That's when I noticed it. A small crack in the far wall near the floor. At first, I thought it was just another sign of the house settling, but the crack looked too clean, like it had been made deliberately. Curious, I pushed aside an old metal shelf leaning against the wall. And that's when I discovered the faint outline of what looked like a doorway. The edges were covered in layers of paint and grime, so it was hard to tell at first. Part of me thought it was just my imagination, but I grabbed a crowbar anyway. The paint and plaster chipped away easily, revealing a narrow wooden door. It didn't make sense. There was no indication on the floor plans of another room, and the basement itself was already the lowest point in the house. The door was locked, but the wood was old and weak. A few solid hits with the crowbar broke the latch, and the door creaked open with a groan. Beyond the door was a small, windowless room. It was dark, and the air smelled stale, like something had been sealed away for decades. I clicked on my flashlight and stepped inside. The first thing I noticed was the floor. Dirt, not concrete like the rest of the basement. The walls were rough stone, and the room was almost unnervingly empty, except for a single object in the center, an old, rusted trunk. I hesitated. Everything about this felt wrong, but curiosity got the better of me. The trunk wasn't locked, though the hinges groaned loudly when I opened it. Inside were layers of fabric, old and moth-eaten, wrapped around something. I pulled the fabric back carefully, and my breath caught. There were photographs, black and white, yellowed with age. The first few were innocuous, showing a family standing in front of the house, smiling stiffly for the camera. But as I sifted through them, the images became stranger. There were photos of people I didn't recognize, posed in ways that looked unnatural, faces blurred or scratched out. And then, at the bottom of the trunk, I found something worse. A journal, bound in cracked leather, filled with handwritten entries. The The writing was frantic, scrawled in uneven lines that made it hard to read. The entries described strange events, sightings of shadowy figures in the woods behind the house, whispers coming from the walls at night, and feelings of being watched. The last entry stopped me cold. It said, "The voices won't stop. I hear them even now, begging me to let them out." I buried it, but I think it's still here, watching. I didn't know what "it" referred to, but as I stood there, I became acutely aware of how quiet the room was. Too quiet. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud and unsteady. Suddenly, the door behind me creaked. I whipped around, but nothing was there. Still, the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. My flashlight dimmed for a moment, flickering as if the batteries were dying, but they were new. I left the room in a hurry, slamming the door shut and piling anything heavy I could find in front of it. I haven't gone back down since. Sometimes, at night, I think I hear faint, scratching sounds coming from below. And once, when I went to the kitchen for a glass of water, I swear I saw a shadow move across the basement door. The trunk and its contents are still down there. I can't bring myself to open that door again, but I'm not sure keeping it shut will be enough. I had owned the house for just over a year, an old colonial-style home in a small New England town. The kind of place steeped in history and shadowed by age. I had been meaning to clean out the basement since moving in, but life had a way of distracting me. That day, however, I decided to tackle it head on. The basement was typical. Low ceilings, uneven stone walls, and a musty smell that seemed to cling to my clothes the moment I descended the creaking wooden stairs. Piles of boxes left behind by the previous owner lined the walls. Most were filled with junk, yellowed newspapers, broken tools, and a few antique trinkets that looked valuable, but gave me an odd sense of unease. As I worked, I noticed something peculiar. One of the walls didn't match the others. While most of the basement was made of old stone and mortar, this particular section was a patchwork of newer bricks, slightly mismatched in color. At first, I thought it was a repair job, but the dimensions didn't make sense. It jutted out slightly, as if there were something behind it. Curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a hammer and chisel from a nearby box and began working at the bricks. The sound echoed unnervingly in the confined space. With each brick I removed, a strange feeling grew in my chest, a mix of excitement and dread. Finally, I broke through to the other side. A rush of stale, cold air hit me, and my flashlight revealed a narrow passageway leading into darkness. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, carrying an earthy smell mixed with something faintly metallic. Against my better judgment, I stepped through. The passage was low, forcing me to crouch, and the floor was uneven, littered with debris. After about 10 feet, the tunnel opened into a small, hidden room. My flashlight beam swept over the space, and my stomach turned. The room was circular, with walls lined in rough stone. At the center stood a crude altar, blackened by what looked like soot or char. Around it were strange markings carved into the stone floor, symbols I didn't recognize, their jagged shapes unsettling in their alien geometry. Scattered across the room were decayed remnants of what once might have been wooden furniture, now rotted and crumbling. But it was what lay atop the altar that truly horrified me. A collection of small, weathered bones rested in a pile, unmistakably human, Among them was a skull, tiny and delicate. The markings on the altar seemed to radiate outward, spiraling around the room like a sinister map. My flashlight caught the glint of something metallic, a dagger with an ornate handle, its blade encrusted with a reddish-brown stain that I dared not imagine was rust. The walls bore faded drawings, crude and frantic. They depicted figures, humanoid but distorted, performing what appeared to be rituals. Some figures were kneeling, others standing with arms raised, and in the center of every scene was a towering, shapeless form, its presence suggested by jagged lines and swirling shadows. A sudden noise broke the silence, a faint, shuffling sound from the passageway behind me. My heart raced as I spun around, the flashlight beam jerking wildly. I was alone, or so I thought. The noise stopped, but the oppressive feeling of being watched grew stronger. I backed out of the room, never turning my back on it, my breathing shallow and rapid. As I reached the basement proper, I sealed the opening with the loose bricks as best as I could, hands trembling. That night, I barely slept. The house felt different, colder, darker, as if the very walls were whispering. Strange noises echoed through the halls. Faint footsteps, a soft scratching, and once a low, guttural hum that seemed to vibrate the air. The hidden room remains sealed, but I can't shake the feeling that I've awakened something. Sometimes, I find the bricks I replaced slightly out of place, as if something, or someone, is trying to come through. And at night, in the silence, I swear I can hear faint whispers calling my name from below.